Alright guys, welcome to another video. This is another exercise video and it's going to be taking a look at something similar to the previous one but with an added plot twist. So we're going to be taking a look at exercise 3, which I've prepared for you guys here. Okay, and exercise 3 is saying the following. So it says create a program that will ask the user to enter 5 grades. And then it says if the average is 50 or above, we should output the message pass. And if it is below 50, then we should output the message fail. Now, let's highlight a few of the keywords again, like we did before. So first of all, it's asking us to enter 5 grades. So this is very important. It's basically saying that we need a loop. So I'm going to add my bullet list here, and I'm going to put loop required. And this is because we need 5 grades. Okay. Since we're asking the user to enter 5 grades, it means that we need to store these grades for later use, since the average is also asked. Okay, so we need a variable for the loop. So variables required. There should be a count for the loop. It should be a num for the numbers that will be entered. We need a sum variable so that we can, so this should help us calculate the average. And then we also need a variable for the average, so I'm going to call it AVG. Okay, and then also there's an if statement here. Okay, so this means that we need a conditional statement. So if the average is greater or equal to 50, and if the average is less than 50. Okay, so this is pretty much all we need to know before we get started on this program. Now, just something that I'd like to point out, since we're going to be calculating the average, the formula for average is equal to the sum divided by the number of numbers. So in our case, it should be divided by 5. But since we're using a loop, we could probably use the counter. Okay? And something else that we should remember is how we add up things. So the sum formula is basically the number entered plus the existing sum. Okay? So this is pretty much it. Let's jump right into it and see how we can make this program. So I'm going to create a new program. As always, I'm going to begin with my structure, which is the easiest thing to do. Exercise 3. I'm going to put a begin and an end statement like so. And as we always do, since we know what variables we need, I'm going to type in variable, and I'm going to say I need a number, so a number variable, so it's an integer. Okay. I also need a variable for the sum, which is also going to be an integer. Okay. I also need a variable for my loop, so it's going to be count, and it's also an integer. Okay. And we also need an average, so I'm going to call it AVG, in short, variable, that's going to calculate my average. Now be careful though, because if I add a bunch of numbers and then divide them, the possibility of me getting a decimal is very likely. So I'm going to store the average as a real number, which means real means basically decimal. Okay. Now, when the program begins, I want to give some of my variables some new values. So when the program begins, I want to tell Pascal that number will be equal to 0. I want to tell it that sum will be equal to 0. I want to tell it that average will be equal to 0.00. Okay? So we've given all of our variables except count a value. The reason that I'm not giving count a value is because I'm going to be using a for loop to ask for my user to enter 5 grades, okay? And I'm going to define by using the for loop where it should start from. So I'm going to type in here my for loop, okay? And I'm going to say for count 1 to 5, since I know how many times I want my loop to be repeated, do the following, okay? And don't forget that we need a begin and an end statement for our loop, like so. Whoops, like so. Okay, so let's begin with the easy stuff. Since we want to ask our user to enter 5 grades or 5 numbers, we're going to start off by saying write-ln, okay? And I'm going to use the same trick we used before, so I know currently how many numbers I've entered. I'm going to show the value of count, okay? And you know what? I'm going to run this just to point out what's happening. I'm going to add a readln, like so. I'm going to compile and save it just to show you guys what's happening. Whoops. Oh, I've forgotten a semicolon here. Okay. So what's happening is it's displaying the value of the counter. Okay? Every time the loop's running, it's showing me what number's stored in the counter. Now, I can do a bit more than that, and I could put a comma and then open a single quote and put a dot. So this means that compared to what I had before, and if I close the quote, look what's going to happen now. Compile and execute, and now it's showing the number that's stored in count. So every time the loop runs, that number becomes bigger and bigger and bigger, and now it's adding a full stop right after it. Perfect. Okay. In case you can't see, let me zoom in. There we go. So this is the number of the count every time the loop happens. So when this appeared, the for loop reached this point here. Then it went all the way up to the top. The counter became 2, and we asked our loop to show that. So count became 2. There we go. And it added a full stop after it. Then it went back and up again. The count became 3. We're showing 3 and the full stop. There we go. And so forth and so forth. Okay. But we want to ask the user to enter a grade. So I'm going to say enter a grade. Okay. And then I'm going to go to the next line. And I need to store this grade somewhere. I'm going to store it in the num variable here. I could have called this variable grade, but I called it num for some silly reason. It doesn't matter as long as it makes sense to you. Okay? And you don't forget. Okay? So our grades are currently being stored in the number variable, like so. Now don't forget that the end task is for us to find the average and see whether we've passed or not. To calculate the average, this is the formula. So we need the sum divided by the number of numbers, which in this case, since we're using a for loop, we can find the number of numbers by using its counter. And that's because we said do it 5 times. Okay? But we need to find the sum first. And the formula for sum is the existing value of sum, which is 0 in the first try, added to the last number the user input, which could be anything. Okay? So let's imagine that the user entered the number 10. So the counter will be equal to 1 the first time. Okay? And it would show 1 dot enter a grade. Okay? And then the user would type in the number 10. 10 will be stored in number, in the num variable here. So now we can find the sum. Or we could start showing Pascal how to calculate it. So I'm going to say sum is equal to whatever the user just entered, which is 10, plus the existing value of sum, which is 0. Okay, so if the user has only entered the number 10, this formula will say 10 plus 0. So the sum is 0. Sorry, so the sum is 10, excuse me. All right, okay. Now, that means that I can calculate my average. If I want to calculate the average, Um, Something that many students do, and it's not a good idea, and you shouldn't do this, is some students will come and calculate the average here. So they will just write the formula that we wrote in our in our Word document here. So they'll write average is equal to sum divided by count. So if they do this, sum divided by count, and they think it's okay, this isn't okay because the average will be calculated every time the user enters a new number. And it's kind of silly to do that. Okay? So this shouldn't be written here. This should be deleted. The average should be calculated outside of the loop. Okay? Somewhere here. Okay? So we can also show the average now. So I'm going to put a right-ln statement after I've calculated it. Right-ln like so. I'm going to say the average was. I'm going to leave an extra space because if I don't, whatever the average will be, it will be stuck to this colon. So I'm going to add an extra space, close my single quotes, comma, and then to show whatever the average was, I need to write the name of the variable that is storing the average. And since we're calculating it and storing it in the AVG variable, I'm going to type in AVG and semicolon. Now the program isn't finished, but it's a good idea to take a look at what's happening when we run it. So I'm going to compile. Whoops, there seems to be an error. I've forgotten to put an equals here. Okay, compile and execute, and let's follow the program together. I'm going to zoom in, okay, and we're going to take a look at what's happening. So the program starts, all these variables are created. Then the number variable, the num variable, is given the value of 0. The sum variable is given the value of 0, and the average variable, the AVG, is given a value of 0.00. Now, I didn't display them like I did before on the top because I think you get the point now. This actually does happen, and then the program immediately jumps into the loop, okay, and immediately sets the count variable to 1. Okay, and it's asking me now to enter a number, but in front of that, it's showing me the current value of the count variable. Okay, and since the loop just started, when the loop starts, it says count is now equal to 1. So that's why we're seeing 1 here. Okay, now the moment I type in a number, let's say 55, and I press enter, that 55 is stored in the num variable, so num is now equal to 55. And then, if I press enter, immediately the sum will be calculated. So 55 will be added to the sum. And if you remember very well, just a moment ago we said that when the program starts, the sum is equal to 0. It's very important you do this. If you don't do this, don't assume that Pascal will know that obviously, when I begin the program, the sum should be equal to 0. If you don't tell it it's equal to 0, don't expect the correct answer. Okay? So when I press enter, 55 will be added to 0, and it will update the value in sum. Okay? Then it's repeating itself, so it's coming back to the loop here. Count has now become number 2 since it's the second time we're running this this loop. Okay, so the count value here is 2, as we can see here, and it's asking for another number. So I'm going to add the number of 88, and I'm going to press enter, and the same thing is happening over and over again. And I'm going to add 55 and 79. Okay, the moment that I press the last one and I press enter, the program will leave the loop. It will finish since it's 5, okay, and it will jump to this line here, okay, and it will do this calculation. Okay, and right after it finishes the calculation, we asked it to show what the answer was on the screen. So we said right-ln, the average was, and then we're showing the average. But take a look at what's going to happen now. So when I hit enter, it added all these numbers together and divided them by 5. Okay, because we said the average is equal to the sum divided by the count. Okay, the count is 5 because it did this loop 5 times. Okay, because we're saying count 1 to 5, okay? And every time it's happening, count is increasing by 1 until it reaches 5, okay? But the problem is, not with our calculation, but how we're showing our average. Since we said the average is a real number, we need to tell Pascal how to show decimals. So in this case, I need to say, okay, so the average is, I'm going to put a colon here, and I'm going to say I want to show at least 3 digits before the decimal place, and I want to show at least 2 decimal places. Okay, I'm going to close this, and I'm going to run it again, and now you should be able to see the difference just by adding, these two numbers here. This is the number of digits in front of the decimal place, and this is the number of decimal places. Okay, so I'm going to add 100, 65, 78, 91, and 33. Okay, so now it's saying the average was 61.17. We're not getting those funny numbers as we were before. Okay, but this part that we added here wasn't asked in the question. It was just to point out that when we're calculating real numbers, we need to tell Pascal how to show them, how to output them. The first number here shows the number of digits before the decimal place, and the second number here shows the number of decimal places. Okay, awesome. Now let's take a look at the next part of the question. It's asking for a conditional statement. We should check if the average was greater or equal to 50, and then we should also check if the average was less than 50. If it was 50 or above, we should say pass. If it was below 50, we should say fail. Okay, so now I'm going to go back into my program, and I'm going to look for where I calculated the average. Okay, so the average was calculated here. So now, after this statement, because don't forget Pascal moves downwards, after this statement, I'm going to check if I passed or if I failed. And you know what? Just for the sake of things, I'm going to leave this on the screen. I want the average to be shown, and then I want on the next line, I want it to tell us whether we passed or we failed. So after this line, after this is shown, basically, I'm going to press enter, okay? And I'm going to make my if statement. I'm going to fix that to look nice. So I'm going to say if AVG was greater or equal to 50.00, like so, then I'm going to build my structure here. So I'm going to say begin and end, like so. And I'm going to write ln. And if it was a 50 or above, I need to say pass, like so. So that's finished. But I also need to add an else statement, else, which basically means otherwise. Whoops, that was a mistake. Otherwise, I need another begin and an end. Begin and an end, like so. I'm going to write ln, and I'm going to put fail, like so. Okay, now be careful. I say this in every video. If you're going to use an if-else statement, when you're using the else, anything above the else in the if statement cannot have a semicolon. Which reminds me, I forgot to put one here. Alright, so let's take a look at what's going to happen. Before we run the program, we might as well dry run it together. So when the program begins, all of these variables are created. These variables are given these values to begin with. So the num variable is 0, the sum variable is equal to 0, and the average variable is equal to 0. And then, once that's done, the for loop will begin, and the count variable that we created here will be given the value of 1. The first time the for loop runs, it gets the value of 1. Okay? Once that happens, the for loop begins, and I noticed I have a lot of spaces here. and I don't like that. And I'm going to delete this one here as well. Okay, and I'm going to create one here just to make it look a bit prettier. Okay, so when the count is set to 1, this means that the loop is ready to go and it should already start. Okay, and inside the loop we said, okay, show me what number the counter is at, so the count variable, and since it's just started, the count is equal to 1. Okay, and then it's saying enter a grade. Whatever the user writes, let's say the user writes the number 100, okay, the 100 that the user wrote will be stored in the num variable. Okay, and then we're going to update whatever the sum is right now. So the sum was 0, so it's 100 plus 0. Okay, and then this loop will come to the top again. It will change the count from 1 to 2 now. Okay, and then it will say 2, enter a grade. So let's say the user enters the grade 90. 90 will be put into num. So num is no longer 100, it's now 90. And 90 plus whatever we stored before in the sum, which was 100, should make the sum now equal to 190. And this will happen over and over again until count reaches number 5. Okay? Don't forget that the for loop is the only loop that counts by itself every time it reaches the end. Okay? Now, once this happens 5 times, the sum should be equal to something bigger. So let's say 365. Okay? And then we're going to make a calculation, and we're going to say, okay, the average is 365, or whatever we added up here, divided by the count, which is, if the loop has finished, 5. Okay? Now, once that happens, we should get an answer, and it should say on screen the average was, and it should show me whatever the number was. Let's say that the average was 98, or whatever. Okay? It should show us at least 3 numbers before, or up to 3 numbers before the decimal place, and 2 decimal places. And then what's going to happen, after this is shown on the screen, it should start comparing to see what it should show next on the screen, because we have a conditional statement. And our condition now is, if the average is 50 or above, then it should show on the screen pass. If it's below 50, otherwise, that's why we put the else, it should show fail. Let's compile and execute and take a look at it together. Okay, so I'm going to zoom this in, and we're going to take a look at it together. So the variables have been created. These variables have been initialized, or in other words, they have been given another value. Okay? There's 0, 0, and 0.00. And now the count is already in place. It's started. Okay? The count is, this is the first time we're running, so the value of count, the number that's stored in the count variable, is 1. Okay? And then we're showing it. So on the screen, it's showing the value of count, which we just said was 1. Okay, and then right after it, it's showing dot enter a grade. Dot enter a grade. Now, it's showing this message exactly as is because it's in single quotes. Now, I'm the user, so I'm going to type in the number 100, and I'm going to press enter. The moment I press enter, this number is automatically stored in the num variable, and then immediately after, the num variable is added to the sum variable, which is 0. Okay? And now we should get the sum is equal to 100. Okay? And it should ask me for another number. Okay? I'm going to add 68, 85, 94, and it's going to ask me for my last grade. I'm going to put 22. Okay? Now, don't forget that every time it's asking for a number, also it's storing it temporarily, like so, and then it's adding it to the previous sum. So in this case, from the first to the second one, the sum should be 100 plus 68. Okay? From the second one to the third one, the sum now is 168 plus 85, and so forth and so forth and so forth. Okay? Now, if I press enter now, immediately after, the average is calculated So we said that the average now is equal to whatever the sum was before divided by the count. And since the for loop has finished, the count is equal to 5. Remember, the count adds 1 every time it reaches this point here. Okay, so the first time it's 1 until here, and then when it comes back up here, it's 2. It's 2 up to here. When it comes back here, it's 3, and so forth until it reaches 5. When count is equal to 5, it means that this for loop will stop continuing. It will stop repeating, and it will go to the next line. So if I press enter now, it will do sum divided by 5. Okay, and now it's saying that the average was 61.50 because I told it to show it like that. And right after, it's jumping to our conditional statement. It's checking. Is the average 61.50 greater or equal to 50? In our case, yes. This is a bigger number than 50. Okay, so it should show pass. If it wasn't, it would ignore this pass section here, and it will go straight into the else and show fail. Let's run it one more time and make sure that it works. So I'm going to compile and execute, and I'm going to put some really low numbers. So I'm going to put 40, 33, 28, 50, and 16. Now the average that's going to be calculated should be below 50. It should be. So it says the average was 27.83, so it's a fail. Awesome. Okay. Now, an important lesson that you need to remember from this exercise. Remember that it's not a good idea to calculate the average inside the loop. Okay? There's no point in me calculating the average every time a new number is entered. Okay? So that's why we've moved the average calculation outside of the loop. It should only happen once. Okay? And once we know the average, then we can do our conditional statement, because Pascal moves from top downwards to bottom. Okay? If I put this below my conditional statement, it wouldn't be able to give me a correct answer, because we wouldn't know what the average was until we reached a further point. Okay? All right. So I hope this one was helpful. I'm looking forward to your feedback. I hope you guys are practicing and building up some questions and experience. Let me know if you need any help, and I'll catch you in the next one.